I don't know, I'm Luciana Spraker. I'm the director of the Municipal Archives, and every month we try to do what we call Hungry for History program, where we talk about some other aspect of local history. And since we have an art theme today, I also wanted to mention that if you didn't see it when you were coming in, on your way out, stop in the Rotunda and look at our current exhibit, Abstracts and Animals. It's a art quilt exhibit by two local artists, Donna Stankiewicz and Jody Beth Wigton. It's going to be on display through the rest of the year, but while you're here, you should take a look at it. It's really pretty. And yes, sir.
Just to the right of the sign-in? Is that the quilt just to the right of the sign-in?
In the first floor rotunda, yeah. So they're really pretty, and a lot of people don't realize they're quilts until they get up close to see all the detail. As an early heads up, our May program is going to be on Tuesday, May 14th at 12 noon here at City Hall again. And we're going to be joined by Bobby Hughes from the Ships of the Sea Maritime Museum, who's going to help us remember the history of the steamship Savannah. We're celebrating the 200th anniversary of its sailing across the Atlantic, which was a very historic voyage, the first time a steamship crossed the Atlantic Ocean. Today, Courtney McNeil, who is joining us, she's the Chief Curator and Deputy Director for Curatorial Affairs at the Telfair Museum. She's presenting Beyond the Live Oaks and Spanish Moss, Art in Savannah, 1920 to 1960. Courtney has served as Telfair's curatorial department since 2006. She's curated many exhibitions at Telfair, including Spanish Sojourns, Robert Henri, and the Spirit of Spain, 100 Years of Harmony, paintings by Gari Melchers, and Mickalene Thomas at Giverny. Before Telfair Museums, Courtney was employed at the Child's Gallery in Boston, where she specialized in American and European prints and 19th and early 20th century American painting. She held a BA from Georgetown University and an MA from Courtauld Institute of Art in London. And before I turn it over to Courtney, I want to say I'm very sorry we're having some technology issues today. So Courtney came prepared with her PowerPoint, and we have a glitch on our end, and some of the images got corrupted when we uploaded to our system. So there's a few images missing, and I apologize for that. We're going to get her PowerPoint after the fact, so our final recorded version will have everything on our website. So if you're really upset that you're missing an image she's talking about, I will make sure to send that out to everybody, the link to the final version that's on our website. So I'm really sorry about that to you guys and to Courtney, because she worked so hard to put this together. So I'm going to turn it over to Courtney now.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming out to spend your lunch hour with me today and talk a little bit about art in Savannah in the early 20th century. I have to say that Luciana was very kind in giving me this invitation to come and speak, and I greatly appreciate it, and I thank you. She gave me my pick of dates, and as I picked April 1st, I thought, is it strange to give a talk on April Fool's Day? Should I be worried? You know, will people expect some sort of joke? So I guess this is our joke, is that there will be some of the images in the PowerPoint that will not be visible. I will adapt as I go. I give a lot of talks, so I'm excited for this little challenge to adapt and still keep your attention and offer you some interesting and hopefully enlightening information about the topic at hand. So as Luciana mentioned, I am Chief Curator and Deputy Director at Telfair Museums, just down the road here in Savannah. As you hopefully know, Telfair consists of 3 separate buildings: the Telfair Academy, the Owens Thomas House, which is a historic house museum, and then the Contemporary Jefferson Center for the Art, which houses our modern and contemporary collection and our big major traveling exhibitions. So the works that I'll be talking about today, most of them are actually about to go on view, opening April 12th in a small installation in one of the upstairs galleries at the Telfair Academy. So in addition to seeing the images in the PowerPoint that Luciana will get eventually to be able to share, you can also see most of these works in person in just a couple weeks' time. So I hope you will find time to come to the museum and visit while that installation is up. So I am telling this story of art in Savannah, or images of Savannah in art from about 1920 to 1960 through the lens of Telfair's permanent collection. So this is a subject that's been on my mind for a while as I've prepared for the Savannah Scenes exhibition that is opening shortly. So it's important to for me to acknowledge the many scholars who've worked in this area before me and on whose research and my own work has used as a foundation. So I'd like to thank previous curators at the museum, including Pamela King and Holly McCullough, and our senior curator of education, Harry DeLorme. All of the work they've done over the years, particularly the 1996 exhibition, Looking Back, Art in Savannah, has been tremendously helpful in laying the groundwork for anybody who's interested in taking up this topic of art in Savannah today. So it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart because you can't tell the story of art in Savannah without also telling the story of Telfair Museums. As you glanced on the screen, there was a picture of Telfair Academy before it vanished. And the Telfair Academy is the one of our 3 sites, the one that opened the earliest to the public. So it was founded through the bequest of Mary Telfair, who died in 1875, and her will was challenged by some distant relatives, went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, which is very rare for a personal estate, and finally it was upheld in 1883, and the museum opened to the public in 1886. We proudly bill ourselves as the oldest public art museum in the American South, and we're among the very oldest in the entire country. We're also the first in the country to be founded by a woman. So, with the origins of the Telfair Academy were not to collect and to exhibit work done in Savannah or made by Savannah artists. The mission, rather, was to bring the best of the broader art world, both in New York, other major U.S. cities, and in Europe, here to the United States for the citizens of Savannah to enjoy. So we originally followed this, beautiful 19th century academic museum format where we had 100 plaster casts of Greek and Roman subjects from antiquity. We had European paintings here you can see the rotunda as it originally appeared in the very end of the 19th century. The paintings were hung salon style, so literally frame to frame, and these were all works that were done by some of the leading artists in Europe at this time. Downstairs we had our sculpture gallery with the plaster casts of the Greek and Roman statues that I mentioned before, and this was the model that we operated on. It was bringing the best of the world to Savannah, not focusing on Savannah art. So the story I'm telling today really begins in 1920. And it begins in 1920 for a couple of reasons. One of those is the fact that when the museum was first opened, there was no body of people in Savannah who had this expertise in running an art museum. So you might have heard that Telfair just got a brand new executive director. He started earlier this month. And when we were looking to hire an executive director, we retained, the best executive search firm who specializes in museum executive placements, and they scoured the country for the best candidates and got us this wonderful new director. But in 1883, there was no such organization. There was no pool of museum directors to choose from because there were about 4 museums in the whole country. So what the executors of Mary Telfair's will did was give ownership and leadership of the newly formed Telfair Museums to the Georgia Historical Society. They formed a board of curators, and they oversaw the programming and the development and the construction and the alterations of the building all the way up until 1920. And it was at that point that the Georgia Historical Society resigned its role as trustee of the Telfair. It had been 37 years, and the feeling was that the organization was well established enough and could stand on its own. There also was a very well-documented desire in the community for more art instruction for Savannians who wished to study art. And it was thought that with this change in leadership, the Telfair would be on its own and it could allocate its attention and resources towards this stated need for the community. Another important thing to happen in 1920 was the formation of the Savannah Art Club, and that group still exists today as the Savannah Art Association. And that group was founded in 1920 with a mission to develop art appreciation in individuals and to further art as a part of the cultural life of the community. And there were many other things going on throughout the South and throughout the country at this time. Most notably in the Southeast, there was the Charleston Renaissance going on in the arts just up the road there. There were groups like the Association of Georgia Artists and the Southern States Art League, all forming to help support artists who were working outside of the major urban centers of the country. And Telfair often partnered with some of these groups and hosted their exhibitions. So the art that was produced in Savannah in the early to mid-20th century was a result of all of these factors. Telfair's new independence and its mandate to encourage art education, the founding of the Savannah Art Club, and the broader cultural renaissance around the South that began after World War I and before the onset of World War II. And so what form did that take here in Savannah? Here in Savannah, the Savannah Art Club was founded by a number of engaged local artists, and the first president was the woman who painted the work that you see here on the screen. Her name was Mary Coleman Lane, and she lived from 1881 to 1966. She did have some art studies of her own. She was from a wealthy family and was able to study in summer schools up in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and it was really instrumental in helping to found, yes?
Was she related to the Lanes, the ones who founded Citizens in Southern Bank?
Yes.
Mosby Lane and all that?
I don't have the exact lineage, but yes, she was part of that family. And the work that you see here is a wonderful Savannah subject that's dear to me because it is the garden of the Owens-Thomas house before it was the Owens-Thomas house. This is how it appeared during the lifetime of Margaret Gray Thomas, who was the person who bequeathed her family's home to the Telfair to operate as a historic house museum starting in 1951, and then it opened to the public in 54. So now we have a formal parterre garden, very lovely, but this image here shows the garden as it would have looked during Margaret Gray Thomas's lifetime. So this is really ironic that these two images are missing, right? And I have to describe them to you because they're both, the title of my talk is Beyond the Live Oaks and Spanish Moss. Both of these paintings are these beautiful, sweet paintings of live oaks draped with Spanish moss. I think they both have azaleas in the background too. And I needed to include these to address the fact that while many artists were looking at subjects that varied from that classic archetype of the live oaks and Spanish moss, there were some who did explore that subject. They did it very well. They're beautiful paintings. They'll be on view in the gallery at the Telfair Academy. And they're by two women who were also very important in this flourishing of the arts in the 20th century here in Savannah. So Lila Marguerite Cabanis was another of the founders of the Savannah Art Club. She's also well known for instituting the first art curriculum in the Savannah public school system. That was back in 1915. And she also began taking public school students on field trips to the Telfair. And of course, we famously still continue our school tour program. We have every fourth grader in Chatham County come through every year. So that's over 3,000 students that we host for a tour of the galleries and then a hands-on art making activity. So this is a legacy founded by women like Lila Cabanis that we're proud to keep going today. Hattie Saucy is another of these artists who participated in many of these group exhibitions, who just loved this local Southern subject matter, despite the fact that she was from a wealthy family, was able to study in New York and over in Europe, but the subjects that she found here in the South and in Savannah specifically were what called to her the most. All right, this is getting tricky, guys. So the person whose image would be seen on the screen here is a man named Elliot Clarke. And so in addition to fostering the work of local artists here in Savannah, there were also things afoot that helped bring in nationally known artists who then use their internationally renowned styles and award-winning approaches to art to depict the Savannah area. So Elliot Clarke is one of those who was brought in as a visiting artist by the Savannah Art Club. He came for the winter in both 1924 and 1925, and that's another thing that's kind of unchanged when we're looking to bring in guest speakers or visiting artists. It's very easy to entice people to come down in the winter months to visit Savannah and spend some time here. You have no idea how often people say, well, of course I'm glad to come and participate in this project, and also it's really nice to be in beautiful Savannah in the wintertime. So I love looking back and reflecting that that was still true even in the 1920s. But Elliot Clarke was an important New York artist who worked in an American Impressionist style and studied under several notable figures in that school. And he took subjects like the bustling activity of the wharves industry on Hutchinson Island and the view of River Street, which was not nearly as popular and crowded at the time. It was kind of a barren industrial landscape at that time. And so he took these kind of off the beaten path subjects and used those as subjects for his work. This also included smoke plumes of Savannah. He was looking at industrial subjects and some really compelling and beautiful work.
I am going to really apologize that we are having this problem. This is not Courtney's fault.
This is in my 13 years of working at the Telfair in many different talks. This has happened to me before where the PowerPoint wouldn't load at all, so at least I have the captions here to tease you. And there were some images that came up, so I keep hoping that others will come.
I think it was the photographs.
Look, there's one.
Okay.
So it's actually great to skip ahead to this artist. This is Christopher A.D. Murphy, otherwise known as Christopher Murphy Jr. And he is among my favorite of all Savannah artists. He, I think, is the most talented of the 20th century artists from Savannah who was able to get recognition and education on more of a national level. So Murphy is well known for his paintings, for his prints, and for his drawings. We see here an example of one of his drawings. This would have been done just steps from where we are under the Cotton Exchange. And it's, again, a really unusual subject that most artists who were interested in exploring the more picturesque aspects of Savannah would not necessarily have gravitated towards. This dates from about 1925, and it has a nice sketchy quality to it. So Murphy also, unlike many of the artists who were working in Savannah at this time, was wonderful at printmaking. And I've thought a lot about his motivations for seeking out these different media, because he was a very talented oil painter as well. He worked in watercolor. You can see he was a great draftsman. And you know, one thing that I keep coming back to is perhaps by working in printmaking, which was a medium that required, you know, these chemicals and inks and a printing press, you had to have a lot of equipment and a lot of education. You couldn't just dabble in printmaking the way you could dabble in watercolor painting if you had, you know, a little kit that fit into your bag. So printmaking was a sign of a serious artist, and I tend to think that he might have gravitated towards printmaking to be able to differentiate himself from some of the, you know, the Sunday afternoon painters or the dabblers that he wanted to set himself apart from. And what I love about Murphy's engagement with Savannah subjects is that he gravitated towards both, you know, this very regal and elaborate architecture, like you can see on the right. Again, we have the Owens Thomas House. It pops up a couple times here. And at the left, you can see these are, this is titled Humble Homes on Jefferson Street. So in both instances, these are small scale works, you know, 3 inches, 6 inches, not very big, which is typical for etchings. And not only is he focusing on the architecture, but you also get these wonderful little figures. Another little thing here. So you see the guy with the wagon, people at their front steps, people in the street, and over here you've got the little figures as well. These were not kind of, you know, cold architectural views to Murphy. This was his hometown, and by populating it with these warm little figures, it really helps to make these images become warmer and more alive to him. So another figure who was not from Savannah but had an influence here is Elizabeth Quayle Emil Berner. She was one of the top figures associated with the Charleston Renaissance and was well known for, like Murphy, portraying her hometown and all types of architecture, all types of people, not necessarily monumental important scenes, but little snippets of everyday life. And she did spend some time here in Savannah and produced a nice body of prints that was done here in the mid-1920s. And this is one of those. So the Harbor Light Savannah was created, let's see. So this shows the ramp at the foot of East Broad Street at the river. And you can see the curved fortified wall and the harbor light above. It's also interesting to note that Berner was an advocate for historic preservation in her home city of Charleston, and also during her time here supported preservation efforts that were underfoot here. And in Fun Savannah trivia, the cast iron Old Harbor Light was erected in 1858 as a navigational beacon, and it stands some 77 feet above river level to guide ships who were approaching the harbor. And it has since been restored. It was restored in 2001. So Mark Sheridan is an artist who's really interesting because we know so little about his work. But this painting is important because it was done and exhibited in the 13th Annual Association of Georgia Artists exhibition. And this work that we're looking at here is the only work in my PowerPoint that was purchased by the museum around the time that it was created. So you remember how I started out saying that the Telfair was founded not to focus on Savannah art, but to bring the best of the world to Savannah. It wasn't until the 1970s, 80s, and 1990s that the museum began to recognize the special role that it played in stewarding this story of art made in and around Savannah, art made by Savannah artists, and began retroactively going back and acquiring these works. So if you're a real museum nerd like me, you can look at the credit lines at the bottom, and the purchase dates are followed by a number, and that's the year of acquisition. So you can see this one was bought in 1941, and most of the others that we've looked at have been 1980s, 90s, or even later into today. This is a lovely work because it takes this very serene nocturnal view. It's down at the west end of River Street. And it's interesting to think of him choosing this kind of calm view of the world in 1941, this really tumultuous time in world events. So we do know that Sheridan was born in Atlanta and studied at the Georgia Institute of Technology and the Pennsylvania Academy before eventually coming to Savannah, where he worked with the Savannah Art Club and the Association of Georgia Artists to exhibit his work. I'm really glad these two images are in here because they're both really special to me. And these are two examples of artists that we would refer to as self-taught artists who lacked that formal artistic training that most of the other artists included in this grouping did. And because of that lack of formal training, the works share a characteristic flatness, sort of a lack of depth perspective. That is pretty typical for self-taught artists. That this is a group of artists that would have formerly been known as folk artists, although that term has fallen out of favor, and now we refer to them as self-taught. So the man on the left, William Golding, has a fascinating life story. So he, as a young boy, was tricked aboard a vessel at the Savannah waterfront when he was just a child in 1882. And he spent decades at sea before finally returning home. So late in his life, he was at a retirement home that specialized in caring for retired African-American seamen. And he was able to do a little bit of art therapy in his time there and began drawing much later in life. So he drew these imagined and sometimes wild, exotic scenes of ports that he claimed to have visited during his 50 years as a sailor. And this is the only known image, or one of only a few images by Golding of his hometown of Savannah. And you can see landmarks in there like the Savannah Morning News building on Bay Street, and of course the tug William McCauley is there in the foreground, and that's what the work is named for. And that is a ship that was built in 1894, based in Savannah, and commissioned by the U.S. Navy during World War I. So I just love the vibrancy and the energy with which he shows the riverfront here in Savannah. And then the same subject by another self-taught artist in a slightly different style is Anna Hunter on the right. So Hunter, although she was a self-taught artist, she was a very educated and involved woman separately from her artistic training. So she was a journalist and she was a preservationist here in her hometown of Savannah. She began writing for the Savannah Morning News in the 1930s and served the U.S. overseas during World War II. So she later returned to Savannah, wrote for the newspaper, wrote a society column, wrote art reviews, and ended up taking a children's art class and falling in love with it, and then began making art of her own and became part of this community of artists here in Savannah. So people refer to her as the Grandma Moses of the South from time to time. But she painted scenes like these that are kind of naive but charming images of Savannah. And another important part of her legacy is that she was instrumental in helping to found the Historic Savannah Foundation, which of course was organized in 1955. And she stayed active as an artist and kept her studio that was right down on River Street until her death in 1985. So she had a long career. So another artist who happens to be a female who was active during this time is Helen Hatch Inglesby, who was better known as the Silhouette Lady. She cut these amazing silhouettes, both portraits of people that were, commissioned portraits, but also these wonderful elaborate silhouettes of, a little boy going crabbing with the nets and his dog running behind him, and these really elaborate silhouettes. But she also was known to sketch and to paint life in Savannah around her as she knew it. So the work on the left is an untitled work that shows a worker unloading cargo down by the port, and then on the right is what we think is a participant in an art class, a sketching class, taking out on a field trip out on the riverfront. But she was definitely one to have been inspired by the variety in her immediate surroundings. As you can see, everything from workers at the docks to the much more picturesque riverfront and the dockside. So Alexander Brooke is noteworthy because he is a really important player in the New York art world in the 1920s and 30s. He served as assistant director at the Whitney Studio Club, which was a precursor to the Whitney Museum in New York that still exists today, exhibited his work all over the country, over the world, and between 1938 and 48, he kept a winter studio here in Savannah, right down on River Street. And it became a focal point for visiting artist friends from New York and for local artists here in the Savannah community. So he was really interested in working in Savannah's less affluent neighborhoods and trying to capture what he felt was more authentic slices of life for the inhabitants of the city, saying that he was more concerned with the simpler and sadder things about me. And I do feel like there's a little bit of sadness in this image that I can't quite put my finger on. Usually a group of young children, you'd have a lot more exuberance in them. One thing visitors often notice in this work is that it's unfinished. So you can see those figures there that are just outlined in kind of white gouache paint. Those would have intended to be filled in later, but interestingly, the artist felt that it was finished enough that he chose to donate it to the Telfair in its current state in the 1970s, near the end of his life, when he was taking stock of his own work and what he'd done and housing it in different organizations. So he gave us a number of his Savannah works at that time. So the building shown in this painting may be the Union Branch Baptist Church, which stood in the neighborhood known as Frogtown on the west side. In addition to the unfinished figures, you can also see the revisions to the church steeples. It's more amplified in person. You can kind of make it out here. They all give you the sense that this was a continued work in progress for him. So an interesting thing about Brooke as well, it's missing. So picture an image like this, but kind of darker brownish colors and just, a couple of figures standing in the middle. But a very similar work to this was exhibited in 1939, and it was acquired by the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh. And at the same time, there was a year-ending column in Art News, which is a national publication, a very important one, that was writing, 1939, war was sweeping through Europe, and this art writer was doing an end-of-the-year summary trying to describe the highlights, the most important painting acquisitions by museums in the past year. And the most important modern European painting acquired by a public collection was the Picasso painting on the right, the famous Demoiselles d'Avignon, that was acquired by MoMA. And the most important American painting acquired by a public collection he deemed to be this wonderful, though you cannot see it, painting by Alexander Brooke called Georgia Jungle that he created during his time here in Savannah. So it's interesting to think about artists like Brooke working on a national scale and bringing their images of places like Savannah onto the national radar. Also, around the same time as Brooke, his wife, Gina Nee, was working in a much more abstract style, but would come with him here to Savannah and would, do these wonderful kind of abstracted landscapes where if you look really hard, you can see a tree maybe or a road, but she really makes you work for it. So she was interested in taking this kind of abstract look at the architectural density and the landscape that she found here in Savannah. Again, Andre Ruellen, we can't see. Ruellen is another of those national artists who came to work here for a brief time and worked in a style that we call the American scene style. So this was a counterpoint to European modernism and abstraction that was so popular in Europe and in New York. There were these regional artists working around the country in smaller cities like Savannah, saying that realistic depictions of everyday life were just as important as some abstract painting that was done for the big museums and exhibitions over in Europe. John Taylor was here around the same time as Andre Ruellen. He was her husband, although less famous. And here we can see this nice image of a river landscape that he created in the early 1940s. And of course, a really noteworthy painting in our collection is this image here of the Old City Market by Augusta Olshig. This painting, I think, is important for a couple of reasons. Olschig was one of those artists who could have worked anywhere. She was of Savannah, she studied and worked in New York, and ended up coming home. Savannah just drew her back, but she had the talent to make it really in any arena. And she turned her lens and her artist perspective to these scenes of everyday life in Savannah that she so loved. So here you can see a really remarkable thing about Old City Market, which is just how it served as this intersection for so many people from all walks of life in Savannah when it existed. So you have everything from, the mom with her little child going shopping to the vendors, there are dogs running around, people with push carts, and it gives you a sense of the energy and the bustle that would have been found in City Market. Of course, the demolition of Old City Market in 1953 was met with protests and as people banded together to try to stop it. And although they were unable to preserve the beloved structure, they did go on to form the Historic Savannah Foundation, which has preserved countless buildings around town and really helped keep the character of Savannah looking the way that we think of it from years past. Ernest Olschig. And then this wonderful painting by Augusta Olschig is actually a very recent acquisition. It came from a private collection somewhere around the Atlanta area. A man had passed away, and his wife reached out to us and said, well, we've got this painting by this Savannah artist. Would you be interested in having it for your collection? And we said, yes, of course we would. What I love about this work is how she's capturing this really unscripted, really casual moment in everyday life. Here a game of front yard baseball in front of this dwelling or store, actually. It's got advertisements on it in Savannah. So at the time, right through the mid-20th century, artists were often pressured to paint important historical scenes, portraits of important people, and there was a lot less acclaim out there for painting ordinary scenes and snippets of everyday life. So Olschig was one who kind of bucked that trend and was happy to depict, all inhabitants of Savannah and all neighborhoods in her work. This image here is another great example of a more industrial view of Savannah. So, as a counterpoint to those live oak Spanish moss painting. And this depicts a train crossing the central of Georgia railroad bridges over the Savannah-Ogeechee Canal. So Holzhauer, this artist, was an immigrant from Germany who had studied in New York with the famed American artist Robert Henri, who moved to Georgia in 1942. So he served as a visiting instructor at the Telfair Academy and made a number of Savannah paintings. And this is one that we were glad to have the opportunity to acquire back in 2005. It's got a real abstract quality to it, all of these lines, the archways, within archways, juxtaposed with the really straight lines of the bridges, and I think it has a wonderful composition on top of a really interesting subject. And then William Halsey is another artist. So we do finally have one image of live oaks to share here, although really a kind of modernist version of live oaks. They have this kind of cartoonish, deliberately cartoonish quality to them. Halsey was one who was influenced by Elizabeth O'Neill Berner in Charleston, and he had the opportunity to study at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts School and serve there in Boston as an assistant instructor. He studied abroad, received fellowships, and then in 1942 relocated to Savannah, where he served as director of the art school at the Telfair. Had a solo show at the Telfair in 1942, and this is the only other work to be purchased in the original time period of the group that I've shown you. It was the purchase prize for the 1943 Association of Georgia Artists exhibition. So this was the way that the museum was starting to collect in the 1940s, and a little bit later we would host these Southern artists, these group shows, and then there would be a juror who would select the best painting in the show, and that painting would get the purchase prize, so the museum would buy it for the collection. And this is a great and abstracted interpretation of the oak-lined streets of Savannah. So the last image I have to share with you today is one of our most recent acquisitions, and this is by Philip Hampton. This work has been on view in the sculpture gallery at the Academy, but has just had to come off view because it's a work on paper. So it can only be out for 6 months or so before it has to go away and rest. So I couldn't move it upstairs with the other Savannah scenes as much as I would have liked to. This was a work here that was just acquired in 2017 and was on view at the Academy for the first time in a long time. So this is a really rare image of everyday life in Savannah from 1954, and it shows two young girls walking on West Gwinnett Street. You can see details like the elevated railroad track in the background, and the kind of notice that's there hung on the wall. We have letters from the artist documenting that he had not intended the girls to be featured in this painting. He'd been working at it, he'd scoped it out, figured out his composition, and as he was on site working on his sketches for this painting, these girls just happened to go skipping past him, and he realized this was just what the work needed. He needed to have those figures in there. And I think they really just give it a sense of scale that the work wouldn't have otherwise, and then a vibrant sort of energy. And Philip Hampton came to Savannah to serve as a professor and the director of the art department at what is now Savannah State University, and he was there from 1952 to 1969. Went on to have a successful career as an artist, not just with works like these, but later working much more with abstraction, and also as an advocate within the arts for his fellow African American artists, and established quite a legacy in that way. So, again, I wanted to point out that many of these works were acquired by the museum from the 1980s to the present day. Just a small handful of them were acquired around the time the work was actually made. So today we really retain this dual commitment to both bring the best of world-class art to Savannah and to also recognize our important role here in the cultural fabric of our city, uniquely positioned to tell the story of art in Savannah. So I plan to continue to research this subject in addition to unveiling the Savannah Scenes show in just a couple weeks at the Academy. I'm planning a larger exhibition next year to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Savannah Art Club. So the show that's going up this month is Scenes of Savannah by artists from Savannah and from elsewhere who are all working here. And then the 2020 show will be work by the founding members of the Savannah Art Club. So I should point out that because I narrowed the focus for today's talk to images of Savannah, there are dozens and dozens of wonderful works in the collection, portraits, wood carvings, and a variety of other things that didn't fit into that small subject that I narrowed it down to. So there is a lot more subject matter to mine and a lot more wonderful Savannah-related art in the collection that could serve as the fabric for many exhibitions and future projects, and I hope it will. So again, I apologize for the images. Use your imaginations, and most importantly, come to the Telfair Academy and see these lovely works in person, because it's better than PowerPoint anyway. So I'm happy to take any questions.
What's the, for Savannah Scenes, what's the full length of the show?
It's going to run for about a year. We don't have the exact closing date, but the expectation is that it will run for a full year. We've been trying to, as we continue to program the Jefferson Center with many changing exhibitions, we've been trying to do very thoughtful but collection-focused shows at the Telfair Academy that then can stay up for about a year to provide people ample opportunity to go see them.
When did you say that one was starting? I'm sorry.
It's opening April 12th, Friday the 12th is when it officially opens. Yes.
Does the museum still make purchases from juried art shows?
Not in that exact same form. So we don't host other organizations outside curated shows, right? We curate our own shows. We have a nice big curatorial team. One project that we've done for the past couple of years has been the Art 912 program, where we have a dedicated space in the Jefferson Center. It used to be the cafe, and curatorial jumped in to claim it for art exhibitions once the cafe left. And we do a rotating series of shows by contemporary artists in that space, all from Savannah in the Art 912 area code. And we have been able to make our first purchase of a work from that exhibition program for the permanent collection. So. Yes?
What is the purpose of, some of those were donated like in memory of great-great-great-grandmother. What's the purpose of that?
Well, a donor can put whatever credit line they want on a painting, so I could donate a painting to the museum, and if the museum wants it and accepts it, I could say, it has to have the credit line saying, recognizing that Courtney McNeil was the most wonderful curator to ever live. It's this, language that can be provided by the donor, let's say. And sometimes people want to do it in honor of somebody else. Sometimes they want to have their name or their parents' name if it was a work they inherited, so it's a very personal thing. Yeah, there's a story to be told in every one of these. Yes?
The New York Times recently had an article about museums that have too much in their collection, and challenges. Is that
Absolutely, it's an industry-wide challenge for sure. Telfair is very much in line with the current trends in the field, which is that we have about 10% of our permanent collection on view at any given time, and then 90% in storage. And because every work that we accept, we're committing to safeguard it for eternity, basically, to the best of our ability in climate-controlled storage, and to catalog it and keep it organized and to commit to researching it. It's a big undertaking and a big commitment of resources. So one thing we did a couple years ago was to put down our first ever scope of collections and collections plan. And we'd always known, we all had in our heads what we collect and what we don't collect. We're not an encyclopedic museum. We don't have Egyptian mummies. We don't have, Dutch old master paintings. There are a lot of things that we have never collected and don't aspire to collect. But by going through and creating our scope of collections, we really broke it down into our strengths. Our decorative arts collection, for example, exists primarily to interpret the historic rooms at the Owens Thomas House and at the Telfair Academy. So it must mainly fall between that period of 1819 to 1840. And by listing it all out, I think that will serve us well as we start to think about deaccessioning in the future and deciding which works we should no longer keep in our collection. And there's a really long and detailed process for disposing of any works like that. It requires a lot of research from the curatorial staff, a consideration by our collections committee and the board of trustees. And once they approve it, it's a long process to figure out the best way to dispose of it, either publicly at auction, donating it to another organization, a nonprofit that could use it. For works that are in terrible, terrible condition, we sometimes would donate them to a school for art conservation so that students could learn on it. So it's very cumbersome, the process.
Given adequate time beforehand, is the general public able to see some of the things that are in storage?
Yeah, so our mission...
Will they be pulled out for the general public or only for art historians or authors?
Well, I guess that's kind of a judgment call. I mean, our mission is to keep our collections for the community and posterity and to make them available whenever feasible. So anytime, we often have SCAD professors who will bring in their classes ahead of time. We have researchers who come in from out of town. Sometimes a family member will say, you have a portrait of my great-grandmother and it's not on view, can I see it? So whenever possible, when it won't damage the artwork by taking it out, we do always try to accommodate those requests. Yes?
What's the criteria? I'm sure there's lots for accepting donations.
So the easy one now is that it has to fit within our scope of collections and collections plan and those goals. So if somebody wanted to give us like the Mona Lisa, for example, we'd have to really sit down and think about it because we don't have the context with which to contextualize it and to interpret it properly. That being said, we would not turn down the Mona Lisa. We do that. But it does help. There are other qualifications like, do we have a similar work in a similar style by this same artist already in the collection? Does it fill a hole in our collection that otherwise we can tell the story of American Impressionism, but we don't have any work by Theodore Robinson. So he's high on the list of artists to add to the collection because by plugging him in there, we have a great context and it would just enrich what we're already doing. The work also has to be in good condition. So besides being relevant to what we do, in good condition, not have any encumbrances. Sometimes someone will donate a work and say, yeah, but I want you to keep it out on view all the time, forever. And, we aren't comfortable making that promise on our own behalf and certainly not on the behalf of a curator who's working in the museum 50 years from now or 100 years from now. So we can't accept donations that come with restrictions either, unfortunately. Yes?
I remember as a child seeing the large sculptures. Where are they now? They were restored?
So we have some of them left, the plaster casts. Those were commissioned by our first director in those years between 1883 and 1886 when we opened. He was traveling around Europe. He was going to the Vatican Museum commissioning plaster casts. It was tough to get that permission because the original sculpture was, it's put in a little bit of danger every time you make a cast from it. Many museums around the country had these plaster cast collections, and then around the middle of the 20th century, people started, trends changed in the field, and the trend shifted towards thinking that these were just reproductions and they weren't important. So a lot of museums, like the Metropolitan in New York and the Telfair, deaccessioned, kind of unceremoniously deaccessioned, a number of the plaster casts. This is also coupled with the fact that a lot of them had deteriorated and were in bad condition. And so I think the thinking was people didn't think they were important anymore. They were in bad shape, so There's some in antique shops around town sometimes. So let me know if you see them though, because trends have now shifted back towards preserving the original vision for the museum, and we'd love to know where they are.
Is that what's going to happen to our Confederate monuments?
That is not up to me.
Do you ever plan to clean the Raphael and Rembrandt in front of the Telfair?
We do. We do. That is a project that we have limited funds for art conservation, so we try to focus them on works that are actively continuing to deteriorate. And as unsightly as some of the grime on those outdoor sculptures might be, they're not actively deteriorating. So it will all get done.
And
Yes.
where did those statues come from? Were they Mary Telfair's or were they purchased by the Academy?
No, so the 5 sculptures that stand in front of the Telfair Academy were commissioned by an artist named Victor Tillner in Vienna by our first director, Karl Brandt. So he, was traveling Europe, building a collection because Mary Telfair was not an art collector. She just thought it would be great to have a museum in her hometown, so she gave her house and all her money. And said, basically we had to figure out what to put in it. So it was very important to the first director of the museum that the public would be able to walk by and instantly know this is no longer a private home, this is a temple to the arts. And so he commissioned those sculptures to stand outside.
What's the museum's vision and interaction with the arts in Savannah for the future? So this is from 1920 to 1960 we were talking about. So is there anything stipulated for the future, and then understanding like new interactions like with SCAD and the SCAD Museum of Art and so forth, and how do those play?
So, SCAD and the SCAD Museum, they have their own mission, and it's not so much to serve the community of Savannah, but to provide a wonderful resource for the students of SCAD, which it does very successfully. For us at the Telfair, our Art 912 program is really the most significant way that we've committed to supporting local artists here in Savannah. Because I think we can all agree it's wonderful to live in a city that is full of active, living, working artists. And it's one thing to just say, oh, isn't it nice to live in such a creative city? And it's another thing to actually support the people who are doing that work and pay them for their work. So our Art 912 program consists of these exhibitions that we rotate 2 or 3 times a year, where the artists, most of them, it's their first solo or their first museum show of any kind. So it's really kind of plucking people from, they're at a different stage of their careers, putting them on that museum level. They get an honorarium for their work. They get to have an opening. We have wine and hors d'oeuvres, and they give a talk, just like the regular shows that we do. So that's been a really great program for us. We also do an annual call for artists for submissions for the windows that the Jefferson Center has that run along Barnard Street there. It's called Boxed In Breakout, and it's really fun seeing what local artists come up with for art installations that can go in that space, because it's a tough space to program. There's bright sunlight on it. And it's really, really tough. But in preparation for the Art 912 exhibition series, I have my modern and contemporary art curator and my assistant curator. They go out into the community. They try to allocate at least 1 day a month to just fill with studio visits for artists. So they're visiting artists. They never leave a studio without getting a recommendation for 2 or 3 other artists that they should then go and visit. And so they do spend a lot of time out there getting to know people and getting familiar with the work that's being done here. So when we go to select the artists for the Art 912 exhibitions at the museum, we feel confident that we're selecting, kind of the most of all the wonderful, interesting artists working, the artists who also will translate well into that museum context. So, that answered your question.
What is the website you go to see these?
Telfair.org to see all the.
The city has something too. This is being filmed.
Oh, to see the lectures?
To see it being filmed.
If you go to www.savannahga.gov/municipal archives, you'll see public programs. And I can also send out to everybody that registered the link for this lecture that'll have the full PowerPoint once we get it up. It usually takes about 2 weeks to get it up. So I think Courtney did a great job of filling in with our And you can, most of the works I talked about today, if you go to telfair.org and then under exhibitions, click Savannah Scenes, most of them are up there and you can see them there. So, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.